When a Palestinian was sentenced to death, their families would come out, their communities would come out when they would hear the news on the day that the execution was meant to happen. The women would come out wearing white with henna on their hands as if they were attending a wedding. And they would protest and they would sing and they would carry the body back to their village to be buried. And this pissed off the British a lot, because the purpose of detention, the purpose of capital punishment is meant to be a deterrent. Situating this properly and making sure that people understand that you cannot be a member of this cause, you cannot stand in solidarity with us if you don't stand in solidarity with our prisoners. Nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli prison, many hundreds who had life sentences. And how are they being met? What is the reception like? Entire towns coming out to celebrate these people. And it's not people crying in the sense of mourning the years that this person has lost, but it's the pride that they feel in their loved ones and the member of their community that gave what they gave to the national movement. But when they see that it's actually energizing people in a way that they hadn't been before, it's only committing them more to the cause. They realize that this has all been for naught. All of this policy, all of this time and effort and money and manpower to detain these large sects of the Palestinian population was not having the intended impact. The majority of Palestinian families have been touched by Israel's carceral violence in some capacity. Palestinian prisoners come out of prison with degrees and much more educated, and again, they're much more committed to the cause than they were before, despite the torture, despite everything. And I think that's what terrifies Israel, but should also give us hope that there really is no breaking the Palestinian spirit.
Today, I'm privileged to speak with Zarefah Baroud, a Palestinian-American activist and emerging scholar. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter's European Center for Palestine Studies, supervised by the renowned historian, Dr. Ilan Pappé. Her research focuses on the origins of Israeli carceral policy, arguing that it's the backbone of the occupation and a tool in Israel's long-standing project of native elimination, predating even 1948. Her work is more than academic, it's personal. She's lost 50 family members in Gaza during the ongoing genocide. As an activist, she channels this pain into action, creating digital education content for advocacy groups to amplify Palestinian voices. In our conversation, we explore the origins of occupation, the prisoner struggle in Palestine, and its vital role in the liberation movement, and the tragic loss of her loved ones in Gaza. This is a conversation about colonization, resistance, and strength in the face of tragedy and oppression. Now, before we begin, I'd like to share a message with you from our sponsors. Just kidding, we don't have any sponsors. And we're probably never going to have any sponsors given the nature of our work. You know the deal, deplatforming, censorship, demonetization, blah, blah, blah. But this is where you come in. If you'd like to support this channel and conversations just like the one you're about to watch, here's how you can do it. Go to our website, propandco.com, and become a member. For just a few dollars a month, you'll gain access to exclusive behind-the-scenes interviews, documentaries, and short films. It's a great way to expand your mind and support our content. I believe that's what we call a win-win situation. Now, without further ado, Zarefah Baroud. The Israeli occupation didn't really start after the Israelis occupied Palestine. It's actually a continuation of the British Mandate. Is that the simplest way to describe your field of study?
Not necessarily the military occupation, but the legal mechanisms and infrastructures that create the occupation.
Like what?
Namely prisons, and that's what I study.
So walk me through that.
Okay, so I think in order to talk about this properly, we need to kind of take a step back. Not to 1967, not to October 7th, but the British Mandate began officially in 1922. And as soon as the mandate started, even prior to the official, when the League of Nations officially granted the authority of a mandate to the British in Palestine, there was extreme and very well-organized popular resistance against the British and the promises that they had made in the Balfour Declaration and their consequent scheming with the Zionists in Palestine. So as a result, they needed to implement repression measures, namely through a very vast carceral apparatus, a network of prisons and detention centers, prison labor camps, which they refer to in British documentation as internment camps and concentration camps in British documentation, in order to repress all of this resistance. So, for example, in 1920, 1921, 1929, there was a lot of, they were what the British would term disturbances in Palestine, which culminated to the 1936 Great Revolt, which at the end saw 30% of all Palestinians detained, deported, dead, or injured.
30%.
Yeah.
So at least 300,000 Palestinians were dead, deported, detained.
Yeah. And this was largely due to a great deal of legislation, namely emergency legislation, that the British had implemented all over the world in different colonies, whether it was in India and Kenya and Ireland, to repress the native people there. But it took on a completely different personality under the mandate in Palestine. Scholars agree that the mandate for Palestine was unlike any other mandate that the League of Nations had bestowed upon anyone because of the Balfour Declaration. Ultimately, a mandate system. The mandate system was put into place in order to apparently or allegedly usher Native people towards independence at the end of the First World War, which the colonial powers, the civilized powers of the world, were put in charge of. But in Palestine, it was very different. After 1917, with the implementation of, or the implementation of the Balfour Declaration through policy and the integration of it into the British mandate, the British promise and their vows to usher anyone towards independence was bestowed upon the Zionists, not the native people of the land. And so a lot of the policies then were informed by these promises that were made all the way in 1917. After the mandate dissolved in 1948, 1947, 1948, the policy was meant to dissolve. The policy was meant to expire. But Israel understood the value of the emergency regulations, specifically the emergency regulations of 1945, which really were a culmination of all the different emergency regulations that had been implemented up until that point. And these policies, of course, provided a legal basis for military courts, administrative detention orders, deportation orders, curfews, home demolitions, etc. They were largely containment focused. They were very carceral in nature, most of them. So Israel then implemented them in Israel proper in 1948 upon the establishment of the state, upon the ruins of historic Palestine. And then in 1967, and they were exclusively used against the Palestinians that had remained in that territory after the Nakba. They're the ones that had survived. After 1967, Israel did the same thing and implemented the 1945 emergency regulations into the administration of the occupied West Bank. So, for example, in Jenin or Tulkarem or Nablus, when we see Palestinian children or young men being detained by the military, it's using the same legislation that they had implemented in 1936 and prior. The same military court system that they will be tried in is the one that was established in 1937. So that's that connection.
Can you take me back to these disturbances, as the British would call them? What would they look like? And when exactly were they taking place?
Right. So there were various ones that happened. There was the Nabi Musa riots. Again, I'm using the language that they use in the British documentation when I refer to riots. And there was also another one in 1929, and it was largely against Jewish immigration to Palestine. We talk about the Nakba like that was the beginning of Palestinians losing their land. But in this sense, and this is what I argue in my research, the British really did operate as a settler colonial regime in Palestine in the service of the Zionist project. So there was mass displacements of Palestinians as a result of the large number of Zionist immigrants coming to the country.
How did that displace Palestinians?
So there are various legislation and the emergency regulations, for example, facilitated this. There was also a lot of economic disenfranchisement that was happening. especially with like Jewish exclusive labor that was being implemented at the time and practiced at the time. So Palestinians were also being kind of forced to sell their land. And then that's where a lot of protests would happen, where they would find themselves in this position where I can't afford to live. The punitive fines, again, under the emergency regulations, which provided a basis for that, has completely destroyed a predominantly peasant population. And so they would protest their evictions after having to be forced and coerced into selling their land and their homes. And this really culminated to this big moment in 1936 after the British police murdered Sheikh Izz-al-Din al-Qassam and many of his men. And they called it the Black Hand Qassamites, or the Qassam brigades, which we're familiar with now. So after...
For the audience who don't know Sheikh Izz-al-Din al-Qassam, can you just quickly explain who he is?
He was a revolutionary that fought in Syria. He fought in Lebanon, and eventually came to Palestine to lead anti-colonial rebellion against the British. And he was killed in 1935 by British police after attempting to mobilize the Falahin in Palestine. He was actually killed in Jenin, which you've been to. And he really left a massive imprint on Palestinian society, and I think that that's clear today. It's not just clear today, but I mean, if you look at the communiques that were issued during the first Intifada, for example, by the United National Leadership of the Uprising, there's a reason why the Intifada leadership decided, and like this, the first time it's mentioned is in the second communique ever issued, where they addressed the people of Palestine as, "O grandsons of Al-Qassam." Now, I think this is really important because when we talk about history, I think kind of from a Western perspective, we compartmentalize things. But I think it's important, if we want to amplify and elevate a Palestinian narrative, to look at the way that Palestinians have been talking about this issue for decades. And they've been very clear, and it's been very obvious to them, this connection that the Zionist movement did not begin in 1948. Zionist occupation and colonization of Palestine did not begin in 1948. It began far before that, and they remember the martyrs and they name the martyrs, like Al-Qassam, which we now see the primary military wing of Hamas is named after Al-Qassam.
The reason why I wanted you to describe what these disturbances look like the British called them riots, right? Mm-hmm. I want to know what Palestinian society was like at that time after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So what their organizations looked like, who called for these riots or protests.
Right.
Did they strike? Was it like a labor strike, or were they mass demonstrations in the streets, or both? If you can paint a picture for us.
Sure. So interestingly enough, and I don't think that this is something that's talked about very often, but there was a massive Palestinian national movement that existed far before Israel was ever established. Before there was ever like a massive Zionist movement in Palestine. And so they led a lot of this organizing, and as a result were at the hand of a lot of this carceral repression, and, you know, served as a large portion of the prison population, or their followers as well. The Great Revolt, it was termed a peasants' revolt, and I think that this is interesting. Specifically, like when you go to any protest, I think this history is it's important to know, because if you go to any protest, if you're in Seattle, if you're in Tampa, I'm sure you guys have protests here, Chicago, anywhere, everyone will be wearing their hatta, their kofiyah. But where did this come from? When was this popularized? This wasn't something that the elite of Palestine wore. This was something that peasants wore when they were out working in the fields or doing whatever. So during the Great Revolt, the British started to understand the demographics behind this uprising and started to target people that were wearing a hatta. They didn't go after the people with the tarbush in Jerusalem or wherever. They went after people wearing a kofia. And so one of the first kind of early signs of collective resistance and solidarity that happened in Palestine was people all over, despite their class backgrounds, adorning a kofia on their shoulders or on their heads to throw the British intelligence off their track or off the track of the actual fighters. So in 1936, that kind of everything that was happening at the time, all the, again, the economic disenfranchisement that was happening, the police violence, the encroaching military presence in Palestinian communities boiled over. And then with the killing of Al-Qassam, it really blew up. And it triggered the longest general strike in colonial history. A few months in, the British Mandate government, or the British Mandate administrator, said, okay, we're going to, if we all calm down for a moment, we're going to issue a commission of inquiry into why this is happening, so we can try to find solutions altogether. So the elites in Palestinian society, of course, as we see today, history repeats itself, were eager to work with the British government and lead this commission and try to get the Palestinian masses to calm down, which of course would be a mistake. And then that's when the Peel Commission was issued, which suggested the partition of Palestine, suggested the mass displacement of Palestinians, even to Transjordan. And so Palestinians obviously were not happy with this. And then the revolt turned into a greater and armed revolt to an extent, because Palestinians, they did not have the resources to lead a massive armed revolt. But that's when it began to escalate in that way, so up until 1939.
When you say the largest strike in colonial history, who exactly was striking? What kind of work were they doing, and how did that impact the British Mandate in Palestine?
Well, again, a lot of them were farmers, which really was the backbone of the Palestinian economy. So it hit the British government, or hit the British hard in Palestine, because a lot of, I mean, the backbone of a colonial administration, a traditional colonial administration, is the exploitation of the native people, the extraction of resources. So a lot of this work then ended up being transferred into the prisons, and prisoners were then forced into essentially slavery, picking oranges, limes, working the fields, all in the service of the British Mandate, who was in service of the Zionist project in Palestine. After the revolt ended, the Zionist militants began to become more empowered in Palestine and realized, okay, maybe we don't need the British Mandate's support the way that we did before. If anything, they're starting to hamper immigration because of everything, all of the trouble that it's causing, all the disturbances that it's causing. And so they began armed insurrection against the British Mandate. And then that's when the 1945 emergency regulations were issued. So these are the regulations that, upon Israel's founding, were transferred. There are, in 1967 in particular, there are legal scholars and assistants that were working with the Israeli military at the time, and spoke very bluntly about how they had to photocopy the emergency regulations of 1945 and simply change the word High Commissioner to military commander, or the Israeli equivalent of what the High Commissioner was. So it's most literally the exact same policy in a lot of ways. In their application in Israel proper, they, of course, omitted some of these policies that were in the emergency regulations, namely policy that limited Jewish immigration. But other than that, a lot of it was kept. And the majority of Palestinians are now, tried under the courts that find their basis in this military court system, or in these emergency regulations.
So why are you doing this research, and why is it important for us to understand?
The struggle of Palestinian prisoners has always been central to our movement, but also central in my own life. I've had a lot of members of my family experience Israeli detention and Israeli imprisonment, people that are very close to me, and I think I wanted to understand it deeper. And what were the logics behind these systems, and the logic behind the way that they've been treated, and that tens of thousands of Palestinians have been treated over the years. If you want to learn about the origins of these policies and better understand the logic, you need to find the origins of it. You need to find who were the designers of the systems that we're seeing today. And I think that sometimes maybe we discount the role of colonialism in Palestine, and we kind of allow Israel to set itself apart from that history, but we need to be actively resisting that. And I think if the last year in Gaza has not been clear enough that we need to be situating Israel as a settler colonial regime and therefore inherently genocidal, this is a great example of how to do that.
So how do you conduct your research?
It's been very interesting. I've been able to conduct many interviews with former prisoners, but also just a lot of work in British archives, looking through whether it's the Palestine Gazette, for example, which was the newspaper in Palestine where all policy updates were issued in the Palestine Gazette, including like curfew orders. For a long time, it was the law that they had to be published in the Gazette before they were valid. So it's really kind of a treasure trove of a lot of information, and you're able to trace a lot of history through looking at these newspapers. Also, British documentation, like letters between military commanders during the British Mandate.
Is that all public record, or do you have to request some of that?
A lot of it is public record, or if you're a student at a university, you have a lot of access to them. Something that was particularly, incredibly interesting but difficult to read were the prison inspection reports from the Mandate inspectors during British rule in Palestine, and understanding some of the conditions that Palestinians had to live in and the things that they had to endure.
Like what?
Unfortunately, it's a lot of the things that if you go right now and read an Amnesty report, it will be a lot of the same things. A lot of the actual prison facilities that Israel uses right now are those old British facilities that were already run down and poorly taken care of. So in that way, it makes sense why a lot of these testimonies and this treatment is similar. For example, let me think. There was a report from a prison inspector that was speaking about, I visited Sarafand today, or I visited Nur Shams prison labor camp today, and they're complaining about not having proper meat. They're saying that the meat is rotten and it's mostly bone, and that's the indication that the animal was dead when they found it. And he goes on to verify that. Palestinian prisoners don't need better conditions than what they lived in, kind of assuming that Palestinians lived in squalor and therefore deserved worse than that, because why should we be treating them better than how they lived before? That's no punishment. If anything, it's an incentive for them to be troublemakers, or whatever they would say. A lot of these types of things. Particularly the prison inspection reports from Nur Shams camp were very disturbing. A lot of prisoners were forced to labor in citrus fields without proper equipment, which led to horrific burns, like acid burns on their backs that would go untreated. Like throughout the Israeli occupation, British medical professionals partook in a lot of this torture and mistreatment, and that was one of those cases where they would refuse to treat prisoners, or they would abuse them while they're receiving treatment.
These prisoners in an open citrus field, so I'm assuming that maybe guards are watching them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's armed guards. And it was, I think, similar to what they then faced in 1948 when Palestinians were then forced to partake in prison labor under the new Israeli administration.
So in your research, you interviewed Palestinians who've been in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And you've read in the archives the experiences of former Palestinian prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some stories that you've come across, either that you've read or that you've heard in person while interviewing these Palestinians?
Mm. It's a good question. There's a lot of stories. There was this fantastic man that I met when I was in Gaza a few years ago, who'd been imprisoned for nearly 25 years. I think something that really stuck with me was the way that Palestinians resist and kind of maintain morale in one of the most dehumanizing and like spiritually destructive environments. The man that I interviewed partook in a lot of prison organizing, was on different political committees inside Israeli jail. Something that stuck with me, I think I asked him about the subject of mental health and about family and how he was able to maintain any family ties, because in order to destroy prison organizing, something that they were often doing was transferring them from facility to facility, so that they couldn't ever kind of maintain a political agenda in a specific prison or program. So he was being transferred every other month, and he went like 5 years without seeing his wife, which I can imagine was so difficult. He had a son when he was initially imprisoned, and when he left prison, that son was married with babies of his own. And I think these stories they're hard to hear, and it's difficult for us to fathom what that means and what that looks like. But I think when you're face to face with someone that's endured this and still smiling and still has so much iman and conviction for his cause, it makes you understand why this struggle and this movement has sustained itself, not even since 1948, but beyond. And I think going back to your question about why is this important to study, I think even for our own sake, it's important for us to understand. For example, like if history had started on October 6th and we didn't have any of this history to look back on or to lean on, I would be extremely concerned about the situation in Palestine right now. But I think once you begin to understand that this movement, this nationalist movement, largely fueled by the Palestinian prisoners' struggle, has endured for as long as it has and grown as much as it has and gained as much leverage as it currently has, it will give anyone kind of a sense of relief.
Can you expand on that a bit more? You talk about the connection between the Palestinian prisoner experience and the movement itself. So can you talk about the relationship between the two?
Yeah. So this kind of goes back to the function of prisons itself. I argue in my research that the application of carceral policy in the occupied territories by the Israeli occupation is inherently eliminatory. It seeks to eliminate Palestinians socially, physically, spiritually, eliminating them. Interestingly enough, the definition of ethnic cleansing, according to the United Nations, includes detention and deportation and torture. So I think cementing this in a settler colonial framework is important in this context. So these policies throughout history have been implemented in order to destroy Palestinian resistance. And so when I say the nationalist struggle fueled by the Palestinian prisoners, it's because if we've ever had an effective leader or effective members of the cause at any degree, they've been in prison. Even more so, I mean, since 1967, 40% of all Palestinian men have experienced detention. So our nationalist movement really is the prisoners' movement. They go hand in hand. They are one and the same. The Palestinian prisoners' movement has in a lot of ways influenced and directly impacted the political situation on the ground. As we've seen over the last year, all of this started in order to release our prisoners. and against these systems of carceral violence that Israel has been practicing for 76 plus years. So I think that this is something that's clear to Palestinians, but maybe not to our movement as a whole. And I think our movement has grown a lot over the last year. And so situating this properly and making sure that people understand that you cannot be a member of this cause, you cannot stand in solidarity with us if you don't stand in solidarity with our prisoners, and if you are not oriented in some fashion with an understanding of what Palestinian resistance means. These things cannot be excluded. You cannot erase Palestinian prisoners in particular from the conversation.
This man in Gaza that you spoke to who spent 25 years in jail, how was he released? Was he released in a prisoner exchange?
He was released on the Gilad Shalit deal.
Okay, so he came out with Yahya Sinwar.
Yeah, in 2011.
You've already touched upon it, but I'd like you to expand some more if you can. So what patterns or themes did you notice in how Palestinians understood their own containment across different time periods?
Right. Something that's consistent, I think, is that because the national movement was so strong and cemented and had a very cemented narrative, this traveled with them into prison. For example, I was recently reading diary entries by a member of the Palestinian nationalist movement during the British Mandate, Akram Zoiter. And he was talking about, firstly, in an entry, he spoke about the pride that he felt when he was just a single unarmed man being taken to prison by a group of British soldiers armed to the teeth, and the deep pride that he felt in this situation. There was also letters that he was writing back and forth with other comrades of his who had been imprisoned, and he wasn't sending condolences to them. He was sending congratulations to them and their families after he had been sentenced in a British military court, likely to be detained for years, likely, forced to perform extreme labor and undergo torture and mistreatment for all of those years that he would be in prison. Something, another kind of act that we see that demonstrates the perspective of Palestinians when it comes to detention. Over these last few weeks, we've been seeing the nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli prison, many hundreds who had life sentences. And how are they being met? What is the reception like? It's entire towns coming out to celebrate these people. And it's not people crying in the sense of mourning the years that this person has lost, but it's the pride that they feel in their loved ones and the member of their community that gave what they gave to the national movement, and to the cause for anti-colonial liberation. But these receptions are not unique either. Like, as the policy isn't unique, the experiences of Palestinians in a lot of ways, and this isn't because this was a reaction from the British or the Zionists, but the experiences that Palestinians had were largely consistent as well in many regards. For example, the British utilized capital punishment far more often, kind of in official capacity. The emergency regulations allowed for the hanging of Palestinians, and over 100 were executed in British gallows. When a Palestinian was sentenced to death at most likely at Moscovia prison in Jerusalem, their families would come out, their communities would come out when they would hear the news on the day that the execution was meant to happen. And would they, again, I'm sure that there were tears, and I don't want to diminish that pain. But the women would come out wearing white with henna on their hands as if they were attending a wedding. And they would protest, and they would sing, and they would carry the body back to their village to be buried. And this pissed off the British a lot, because the purpose of detention, the purpose of capital punishment, is meant to be a deterrent. But when they see that it's actually energizing people in a way that they hadn't been before, It's only committing them more to the cause. They realize that this is all been for naught. All of this policy, all of this time and effort and money and manpower to detain these large sects of the Palestinian population was not having the intended impact. So that's when we start to see corpse detention policy come to the fore. So for example, if a Palestinian was executed at the gallows, they would often stop allowing the Palestinians to receive the body because they didn't want the massive demonstrations outside al-Muscabiyah. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. So we're actively having these conversations around Israel doing this today. As Palestinian prisoners are being released, they outlaw demonstrations. They won't allow Palestinians to be with their families, to be with their communities. They'll enact violence against people that come out to receive their loved ones from Israeli prison. And again, this isn't, it's different hands enacting it, but it's largely for the same reason. But not only just for the same reason, but the Palestinians also have the same reason for why they're demonstrating. Their conviction has only grown stronger over all of those decades.
Can you talk about, I guess, the Palestinian prisoner culture within the prisons itself? So you talked about the diary of this man, Akram. You talked about how, he would send letters of congratulations and he had this strong pride, and this could be felt perhaps amongst other Palestinian prisoners. But let's say you're a Palestinian teenager and you just aren't necessarily that informed of all this history and this culture of the Palestinian prisoner, but you just respond impulsively and you throw a rock at a soldier, for example, and then you're arrested and detained. Before they throw that rock, are they aware of this culture and this history, or do they then enter the prisons and then become made aware of this culture as they're taught by other elder Palestinians, let's say, in jail?
I would think it's both, considering how, the majority of Palestinian families have been touched by Israel's carceral violence in some capacity. So they're not removed from it by any means. Many of them maybe had an uncle imprisoned, or a brother, or a younger sister, or whoever. So there's always a connection to the prisons, no matter where you are in Palestine. Even in Gaza, after Israel's disengagement in 2005, 2006, disengagement, I want to say in quote marks, less Palestinians were being imprisoned in Gaza because there weren't boots on the ground the way that there were before. But still, if you go to Gaza, so many people that I met were somehow still being impacted. They still had loved ones in Israeli prison, or a friend, or an uncle, or whoever. So I don't think that there is a way, if you're a young teenager, for example, in this example that you're giving, for you to be completely detached and unaware of the culture around these things. But what does exist in Palestinian prisons is kind of this culture of camaraderie, especially when younger people are coming into prison. There are many testimonies and stories of people, whether they're older or younger, of, a younger person coming into prison and the elders in prison taking them under their wing, whether it's for protection, whether it's to provide them with a father or mother figure while they're in prison. And something that's extremely prevalent is the education structure that they have in prison. Khalid Jarrar, for example, who was just released after 5 months of solitary confinement. Something that she's been known for in her, over time, she's been arrested for periods of time, culminating to 5 years under administrative detention. And every time she's been in prison, she works to educate young Palestinian women who weren't able to finish their high school diplomas or their Tawjihi exams. And so they've created this entire structure, which Israel has tried vehemently to repress. But there's definitely a culture of camaraderie and empowerment, even to a sense where Palestinian prisoners come out of prison with degrees and much more educated. And again, they're much more committed to the cause than they were before, despite the torture, despite everything. And I think that's what terrifies Israel, but should also give us hope, that there really is there's no breaking the Palestinian spirit.
Is it appropriate to characterize Palestinian detainees as hostages?
Can I take a sip of coffee, please?
Yeah. You're not a hostage yourself. The reason why I asked that question is because in our first exchange, I didn't really understand what exactly your position was, but you mentioned how you wanted to comment on the usage of the term hostage.
No, I'm excited about this question. That's why I needed a quick caffeine break.
The part I liked a lot was when you talked about the Palestinian women, putting on henna and going to collect the body. I think that was a powerful
when
clip.
I was reading these stories, I was weeping like a baby. And alhamdulillah, that's why I feel so lucky to be able to be doing this research, because these are stories that we don't hear. Even if you're actively involved in Palestinian prisoner solidarity in the US, these are stories that you don't hear. These are people that passed away decades ago, and their stories they're with Palestinians in their heart. You know what I mean? I think that they're ingrained in Palestinian society in a way, even if we don't know their faces or their names. But it's something that it does bring me to tears to hear their stories. And I think the pain of a Palestinian mother is just really something that cannot be fathomed, especially when you're reading these stories, and the strength. Yeah.
So this question of, is it appropriate to characterize Palestinian detainees as hostages?
I think this is an interesting question and an important conversation. I think that we, as people, as Palestinians, as people standing in solidarity with the Palestinians, can afford to be a bit more precise in the language that we're using and a bit more critical of whose narrative we're peddling. I am personally of the belief that we should be speaking about Palestinians the way that they're speaking about themselves. If we truly stand in solidarity with them, if we've truly humanized them in our minds, we should take seriously the way that they've positioned themselves within all of this. As I've mentioned, Palestinians throughout history have never understood themselves as victims. They've been victimized, but it will be rare for you to find instances of Palestinians assuming this identity of a victim, especially Palestinian prisoners. Again, if Palestinian prisoners understood themselves as hostages, would they be sending each other congratulations letters? I don't think so. Would they be out in the streets celebrating? Would there be honor bestowed upon the families of prisoners if they were hostages? And I'm not saying that to be a hostage is dishonorable, but it does insinuate a passive nature. That's why I feel that we can be precise in how we're discussing this. But Palestinians, for example, that were tried in a military court for an offense like stone throwing, for example, would they consider themselves a hostage? It kind of, I think, takes away their political agency that they've sacrificed so much for. Especially, under Israeli repression, I think to further strip them of that agency and the identity that they've bestowed upon themselves is a disservice to them. Even I don't think people do it. I don't think people refer to Palestinians as hostages in a cruel way. I think that we can just perhaps talk about it a little bit more precisely. For example, the mass arrests and sweeps that were occurring during the genocidal military operations across Gaza. Perhaps we could consider them hostages. Again, I'm not sure how they would describe themselves, and as time goes on, as they're slowly released, we'll see the way that they're orienting the conversation. But for example, the Palestinian resistance isn't referring to them as hostages. They're not coming out of prison referring to themselves as hostages. So I think that we need to be a little bit...
What do they refer to themselves as?
As prisoners, or as political prisoners.
Okay, so while we're on the topic, I suppose, of language, how does language, whether from colonial authorities, Zionist narratives, or Palestinians themselves, shape how we understand imprisonment and freedom in the context of Palestine?
Is there a way of rephrasing it?
Why does language matter in the context of Palestinian liberation? Like, who cares what you call them? And you've already kind of answered this question a little bit based on what you just said, but, who cares what you call them? Hostages, prisoners. Why does it really matter for us to be specific and precise with the language, as you were saying?
Throughout colonial history, whether it's during the British Mandate for Palestine or the British anywhere else in the world or the French anywhere else in the world or the Dutch anywhere else in the world, they've actively controlled the narrative around what it means to be a prisoner, often kind of insinuating that prisoners are criminals or people disturbing order, or kind of, again, stripping them of that agency, removing the political agency from the prisoner and bestowing upon them their perceptions of criminality, or their perceptions of what it means to be a barbarian or a savage or any of these other things. And I think being in the US, I would like to, if we're speaking about narrative, again, I don't subscribe to this idea of the criminal prisoner either, whether it's in the United States, whether it's anywhere else, because I think a lot of the crime that we see in this country is inherently political, whether or not it's described as such, whether or not the prisoners in the US understand themselves as such. But a lot of the alleged crime that we see in this country is the result of racial violence, of state violence, of economic violence. So when I speak about criminality, I want to make that clear that I'm not subscribing to the understanding of, for example, an American criminal prisoner, because I don't believe in that. But colonial powers for so long have tried to, again, strip Palestinians of the identity that they've given themselves as sometimes living martyrs or heroes, or, during the British Mandate period, there was poetry and folklore written about prisoners that was everywhere. I think a lot of, the very traditional Palestinian poetry and art is also surrounded and entrenched in this carceral space. So when we, as a movement, again, as people standing in solidarity with the Palestinians, we often hear people saying, we need to assert a Palestinian narrative. This doesn't mean just talking about Palestine. This means being very intentional with the language that we're using and not coming as an American or as someone from the UK or Australia or wherever you are. Your solidarity is appreciated, but you are not the one that gets to dictate the narrative and the discourse and the identity of people that have sacrificed more than the majority of people for this cause, and instead give yourself the authority to dictate that for them. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yes, you answered it very well. Like, I'm kind of envisioning the comment section already. I know people are really going to appreciate this podcast. You're actually the first female guest that we've had. Told me. Yeah. You identify as a woman, right?
I identify as a woman.
You sure you're from Seattle? You sure you don't identify as anything else?
We'll see. We'll see how I feel tomorrow.
Okay. Jeez, okay. Maybe they won't like you so much in the comment section.
No, don't include that.
No, that part's going in.
Please. I'm going to start looking at the camera like I'm on The Office.
So you said you've had family members who've been jailed, imprisoned in Palestine. Mm-hmm. How many family members?
Oh, I don't know that number off the top of my head, but a good handful of people.
Can you paint a picture of what it's like to be a Palestinian prisoner? Do they let them commingle together? Are they all in solitary confinement? If the prison is so important to the Palestine movement, right, and these Palestinian prisoners are coming out of prison having organized some sort of political agenda within that prison itself, or if they're coming out with degrees and it's so important to the Palestine movement, why would the Israelis even let them commingle or talk or do anything in these prisons?
Over the years, the movement has grown so strong that they've gained a lot of leverage in prisons. And so, over this last year is kind of a different story. And I think that we're going to be learning a lot, not only about what they've withstood in terms of torture, but the repression that occurred over this last year. For example, Khalid Jarrad, who was organizing so effectively in prisons for years, and outside of prisons on behalf of the prisoners for years, She was kept in solitary confinement for 5 months, largely as a result of this impact that she's had on young girls and the way that she was able to mobilize people. But during her incarceration, for example, it's not that the Israeli prison authorities were giving them any favors or giving them any privileges. It was the result of decades of organizing and the threat of prison strikes and work stoppages and all of these things that really forced the prison administration's hand to abide by certain rights ingrained in international law, and honestly, very, very, very bare minimum. So she speaks about, for example, they used to have a whiteboard where they would do lessons, where different, again, so many Palestinians have been detained. They're not just like kind of your average Joe. A lot of them are professors or grad students or lawyers or doctors. Like we've seen over the last year, there hasn't been a massive demographic shift in who's been targeted. So there are plenty of people to educate the young prisoners when they're coming in. So, for example, they would have a whiteboard, and then they would give a lesson, and then the prison authorities would confiscate it. So then they would take down like a window and use that instead to write on, and then they would take the markers, and then the prisoners would say, okay, hunger strike, and force their hand essentially to give them notebooks or allow them certain texts or, etc.
Can you explain why a hunger strike would be effective if the Israeli goal is to use prisons to eliminate Palestinians and they're starving themselves?
Right.
They're kind of doing the Israelis a favor. So why would the Israelis respond to a hunger strike?
I think that there are two factors to this. One, which I think is the most important, is Israel still, hanging by a thread, attempting to absolve itself of its settler colonial past, which all settler colonies do, try to establish a permanence in a territory, and with that comes a reputation on the world stage. Like, I'm not sure if many average Americans would consider the U.S. a settler colony, because the U.S. has done a very effective job at, over time, kind of establishing itself as a legitimate modern state. Israel's still attempting to do this. And obviously being exposed day after day for being the opposite of a modern legitimate state. And so in that sense, I think they have, again, I have to specify before October 7th, have attempted to show the world that they are, that they're just like any other Western nation state, that they bestow certain rights upon prisoners, and when they don't bestow them, they use justifications as this person is an existential threat to the state of Israel, or a terrorist, or use any of this language that would invoke people to feel, okay, you can strip them of their rights, that's fine. So I think that that's a part of it. Hunger strikes bring a lot of bad press. People get interested. Why are these prisoners so moved to literally starve themselves? What is happening to them? And it brings intrigue and interest and curiosity that the IPS, the Israeli Prison Service, does not want. But also it mobilizes Palestinian society. And this is dangerous for Israel, because a mobilized Palestinian society, no matter how much artillery they have, they can't contain all of Palestine. Or, dominate all of Palestine in this way. And we've seen that over the last year in Gaza in particular.
Can you talk about how the insanity of an indigenous people being arrested and detained by an entity that has no right over them legally, and is on their land, just arresting them without charge, holding them indefinitely, and not releasing them unless one of their own citizens are taken hostage?
Right. I think for us, outside looking in, or simply as people that see Palestinians as human beings, do see it as insane, as insanity. However, in the mind of a settler colonist, it makes perfect sense. We see it obviously as problematic when Israel will try to defame Palestinian society at large as savage, as dangerous. And in many ways, to the settler colonists, the existence of Palestinians is dangerous. Palestinians cannot exist in coexistence with the settler project that is hellbent, and not only hellbent, but requires their elimination. So these policies which abuse and contain and disappear Palestinians en masse makes perfect sense. And that's why it's been key to the settler project from the very beginning. It was 3 days into the 1967 war when Israel revived the military court system in the occupied territories. I think that's important for understanding the central role that not only the prison as a physical space has played, but carceral spaces altogether, and the impact that that's had on the Palestinian psyche. Because whether or not they're physically imprisoned, I gave you the number earlier, 20% of all Palestinians, and this number I'm sure has grown exponentially over the last year. 20% of Palestinians have been detained since 1967, including roughly 40% of all men. You could even go farther and take your definition of what it means to be incarcerated a little bit farther. There were moments during the first Intifada, for example, like on Land Day, when Israeli occupation administrators anticipated large-scale protests. There were moments where, like Land Day, where every inch, every neighborhood, every town, every locale of the occupied territories was under military curfew. This is the containment and the imprisonment of every single Palestinian living in the occupied territories. So in that sense, I think the statistic is much more disturbing and really exemplifies the way that these carceral spaces have encompassed Palestine completely.
So let's rewind a bit and let's go back to the British Mandate, because I think maybe the way I've been asking questions hasn't really afforded you an opportunity to open up on some more of these details. But when you study, I guess, reading the article that you sent me and reading more about the kind of research you do and the work that you're doing, one thing you come across are the specific tactics the British would use. And so there's two I came across. One, home demolitions, and the other is the bone crushing. So can you talk about home demolitions and bone crushing?
Right. So home demolitions were used throughout colonized territories by every regime. But again, is the British use of these tactics really does, I think, cement it. And again, what I argue in my thesis, that the British operated as a settler colonial regime in Palestine, in the sense that they were actively displacing thousands of Palestinians through home demolitions, through policies which, closed military zone policies that would displace Palestinians from their land, from their agricultural land. You are permitted to basically shoot them on sight if they're crossing over these lines. For instance, there were periods during the British Mandate when entire neighborhoods in Jaffa would be demolished. And these were, again, policies that were integrated into the emergency regulations and then, as I mentioned, transferred into Israel's program for the occupied territories. So the British demolished many houses. They also saw it as a deterrent. For example, if there was a particularly troublesome village, they would go in and demolish a house. The way that they used legal mechanisms to kind of provide them a cover to the world, that they had a right to be this civilizing mission in Palestine, meant that they would use tactics that they would see as legal and they would understand as legal. For example, they would use canine units to track the scent of a perpetrator of some alleged attack. And if the dog lost a scent in a certain neighborhood, they'd basically pick a house at random and demolish it. Again, as a deterrent to that village, as a way to try to encourage Palestinian communities and societies to turn on one another. For example, you can imagine if you committed a crime and I'm your neighbor and my house gets demolished for something you did, I'm going to turn on you. But Palestinians, these collective punishment measures were never effective in fragmenting Palestinian society. If anything, it made them that much stronger and that much closer. And that's what aggravated the British. It's what continues to aggravate the Zionists in Palestine.
Since 1967, like tens of thousands of, maybe more, of Palestinian homes have been demolished.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's designed to apply pressure on Palestinians from their family members, their neighbors, their community, to tell them, don't engage in resistance, don't throw rocks, don't attend protests because you're going to make our lives a living hell. Or they
also did this through like collective fining and other methods. For example, if they heard that there were weapons being stored in a specific neighborhood, they'd have all of the members of that neighborhood come out and they would cage them, they would torture them in front of their families, try to apply a lot of pressure to turn people on one another. But again, it was all for naught. It never worked. Because the nature of Palestinian resistance is at its core a collective activity. It engages Palestinians collectively despite their class background, despite anything. Even though it has been the Palestinian working class, it's always been fueling Palestinian resistance. And never engaging in collaboration or any of these things that sometimes the Palestinian elites have. It has largely been an all-encompassing struggle. And so their efforts to try to divide people never worked, and they used many tactics to try to do so.
What was, you said the British tried to make everything appear legal and understand everything is legal. So how did they make sense of breaking the bones of the indigenous population that they were occupying, essentially? How do they rationalize this as legal?
This has a lot to do with states of emergency that, for example, during the 1936 revolt through 1939, and then people argue that even, now, because the emergency regulations are still in usage in the occupied territories, that it's a permanent emergency regime. But under the circumstances where there's an active counterinsurgency taking place, it's understood that you can tweak the laws a little bit. You could modify them. You can adapt them as you so please. For example, there are letters back and forth from different district commissioners in Palestine, saying, we want to implement curfews in a more effective manner, but right now, British mandate law says that that Palestinians need to be notified in the Palestine Gazette before it's officially issued and we can actually implement it and take out their violence on Palestinians that are breaking that curfew. And so they immediately amended the law. Again, it's really arbitrary, but it was in the law. And so that kind of gave them this cover. It gave them this cover as, again, the civilizing mission in the territory to really do as they pleased. As long as it was in black and white, it was on paper that, okay, now they just have to blow a siren, and anyone outside after the siren is blown, open fire. This is the way that the British operated in Palestine and around the world. And it's the way that Israel operates. I mean, largely they consider a lot of the practices that they continue to implement legal and according to the rule of law. But under a colonial structure, the rule of law really is null and void. It's used as a cover for the worst brutality that you can imagine.
So Palestinians are dealing with the fallout of the British mandate, and they're dealing with an Israeli entity the settler colonial entity that refuses to acknowledge their humanity, to acknowledge their rights, and just to be seen, to be heard. Palestinian resistance, has to go out and do things that surprises and shocks the world, that is mostly overlooking and ignoring the status quo, which for Palestinians is like unbearable and unacceptable. So for us living in the West, given that, the Israelis only respond to such drastic measures, we'll call it, what can we do in the West as privileged citizens living in safety and security to advocate for Palestinian rights and try to be part of this movement for justice for Palestinians?
Right. I say this pretty often. I feel like even Palestinians in the West can be a little bit narcissistic in the sense that they tend to kind of center themselves in their own voices. I think, as I mentioned, if we're really prioritizing the amplification of a Palestinian narrative, it's not only amplifying, it's centering it. It's following their lead. I think if the Palestinians, especially the prisoners, have proven anything to us, whether it's from the 1920s when these letters of congratulations were written when someone was sentenced by a military court, up until today with Khalid Ejrar speaking up as loud as ever, and our prisoners being released, kissing the ground, saying Allahu Akbar with scars on their bodies and forced amputations, and maintaining this discourse that's only becoming more solid. I think that they've proven to us that our movement is in the right hands. It's not ours to take from them or adopt as our own. But it's our responsibility to be listening to them and to be actively engaging with them and not speaking on anyone's behalf. Does that...
It's a great response, but so what do I do to help, basically? All right, center a Palestinian. All right, I've centered you, so... But you're in the West, so you're actually being narcissistic.
Yeah, that's true. I'm a narcissist.
But you are centering and amplifying what they're doing in Palestine. But what can I do? What can the viewer do to contribute other than centering Palestinians?
I think that over the last year, especially, Americans have been very effective in their organizing, whether it's with the encampments, with the mass protests, with all of these things, with the boycotts that have hit these companies so hard, whether it's Starbucks or McDonald's or any of them, Reebok now. I think continuing on that path and continuing to, I think, also identify ourselves, whether we're Palestinian or not, but learning more how to identify our own oppression that we might face in this country with what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, and understanding our liberation is intertwined and interdependent on one another. So again, boycotting is fantastic.
How far does that go, though?
In what sense?
You might have, a leftist liberal, let's say, transgender person, and they might say, my liberation is intertwined with the Palestinian living under a settler colonial entity, right? Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a loose connection, I think. So how far does that intersectionality go? Right. Well, in an effective way. Not to, I'm not trying to make this about trans people, but their experience is very different.
Their solidarity is so deeply appreciated. I'm sure if I thought harder about it, I could think of something, but I think when I make that reference, I'm talking about racial violence, I'm talking about colonial violence and the relics and the artifacts that are left over from centuries of colonial violence in this country, whether it's violence against immigrants, against so-called illegals on their native land, the exploitation of all kinds that occurs in this country. It's all connected to this to this global colonial structure that has existed maybe under the radar of a lot of people because of the effective propaganda machine in this country, but I think that there are various connections. I mean, there's the obvious ones like police violence. I mean, ever since 9/11, American police, like the Seattle Police Department, for example, has been receiving training from Israeli forces and Israeli intelligence. And as different types of surveillance technology is developed in Israel, I think Israel has the most like surveillance or tech or firms in the world, those are all coming back to us and on our streets and with our police departments and at our border. So understanding that so long as Israel exists as this colonial, violent entity, so long as the U.S. exists as a colonial, violent entity, the occupation will persist if the U.S. persists. You know, it's not even about collective liberation, as if my black brother isn't free, I'm not free. But if the systems that exist that make him captive and oppress him and exploit him continue to exist, then it's logical that the ones that are oppressing me in this moment will still exist as well.
You as a Palestinian, are you a one-stater, a two-stater?
I will remain with the position that Palestine needs to be decolonized. Israel cannot exist the way that it does at this moment.
So what does that mean?
For example, if I at all acknowledge that Israel can exist in the form that it does today as a settler colonial entity, the very structure of Israel is predicated on my destruction. If Israel exists in the way that it does right now, I cannot exist. So there, in no world can I agree, for example, with a two-state solution that will mean that my village of Beit Taras still is not in my possession. It is not in the possession of my family or the descendants of people from Beit Taras. I will never accept that. I believe that if Israeli society can come to a point where they understand that they will destroy themselves in the process of trying to destroy us, as they have, that the only other option is to actually understand that we are equal human beings, that they do not have some, they're not religiously entitled to my land, then I can attempt to live with you after everything that you've done to us.
So you are a two-stater, but not now?
No, absolutely not a two-stater. We can live in a liberated Palestine together.
A one-stater.
Yeah.
So you have basically two ideas for a one-state. One state is that you all leave and we keep Palestine. Or if you decide to stop being ethno-supremacists, then we can live together.
Absolutely.
What does the right of return look like under such a circumstance? Can Jewish Zionist Israelis relinquish Zionism and decide to stay, but say, you know, I was born in this house. I was born in this area that you're saying belongs to this Palestinian who's now a refugee in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Syria, and you want them to come back. Do I need to give up that property?
I think this is something that can be discussed, but honestly, I don't think it's as big of an issue as we give it credit for. My village, for example, like many villages, of the 530 Palestinian villages destroyed during the Nakba, are still there. The rebel of our village is still there. The minaret of our masjid is still there. No one is living there. The reason that they removed us is because they cannot live with us. In order for Israel to exist as a Zionist and Jewish supremacist state, we can't be there. It's not because there wasn't room. And that's the case for a lot of villages. I don't have the exact number, but many of them are still unpopulated. Many of them, the Jewish National Fund fundraise all over the world to grow forests on top of the villages. It's not an issue of space. And these specific instances, I'm sure, could be discussed, but I don't think it's as... I think Israel tries to kind of center this idea, if Palestinians are liberated, that the only other logical option is that we're thrown into the sea. This is ridiculous.
Right. It plays into their argument when they say from the river to the sea is a genocidal call.
Yeah, exactly.
Despite the fact that they're the ones committing genocide right now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty of space. There's plenty of space.
So you have a problem with a two-state under the current dynamics, but the Palestinian resistance, they support a two-state. So how do you feel about that? Or do you just chalk it up to them just being, I guess, I know a lot of Palestinian activists don't like this word, but pragmatic.
Or strategic, maybe. Again, it's difficult for me as someone to accept that because my family was displaced in 1948. by Zionist militias, backed and trained by the British, to Nusayrat camp, to Barej camp, to Shati camp. We want to return too. The assumption is with the two-state solution that it would still be a Jewish ethno-state within a smaller portion of historic Palestine. That still does not bestow upon me my internationally enshrined right of return as the descendant of refugees. So
Nurdin Kaswani, you know her. She
of course,
tweeted
she's
today.
amazing.
Yeah, she tweeted today. She talked about this very question. And she talked about how it doesn't make sense to agree to a two-state, right, like you said, and still have a Jewish ethno-state right next door. And if Israel's going to relinquish or give up Zionism, then it begs the question, what is the point of Israel's existence if it's not to be this Jewish supremacist ethno-state?
I guess that would be up to the Zionists to decide if they would care to maintain Israel at all if it wasn't a Zionist entity. Or what the Israeli populace at large would feel about this, if they feel that they could divorce themselves from this ideology, if it meant their own continued existence and their own safety.
What was the name of the village that you said your family's from again?
It's called Beit Taras.
And where is that exactly?
It's, I recently looked this up. It's like a 4-hour walk from the Eretz crossing. So like the northern Gaza crossing. It's a 4-mile walk north.
4 mile or 4 hour?
4-hour walk north.
Okay. I don't usually walk 4 hours, so I don't know how to quantify that, but I'll look it up and I'll put an image on the screen. So your family was ethnically cleansed from this area, and so you're not actually from Gaza, but your family relocated to Gaza?
Yes, or they were displaced to Gaza.
Right away, or did they hop from area to area?
Within like the month or two where they were being actively displaced and chased out, there was kind of a going from village to village all on their way to the refugee camps, or what would become the refugee camps.
And so where in Gaza did they settle?
In Nusayrat camp mainly. My grandmother, Zarefah, who I was named after, is from the Barej camp, which is right next door. But when she married my grandfather, Muhammad, Allah yarhamhum, they moved to Nusayrat, where my dad was born and raised.
So your father was born and raised there, obviously eventually relocates to the United States, but you still have many family members in Gaza, and I think you were telling me earlier you lost 50 family members in the last year. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that would be, maybe beneficial for the audience to hear. You've only been to Gaza once, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so many of these family members, you met them for the first and only time.
Yeah.
So what was that like to go and meet people that you know are your family, you believe are your family, but you've never really had a connection with them? I
was so nervous because before that I had only known them through Skype calls and WhatsApp messages and, the annual Ramadan call that your dad kind of forces you to take. But I was never able to put faces to names. There was a connection, but it was only as strong as it could be when it was completely virtual. But I was so surprised to find that the second my auntie, Allah yarhamha, picked me up from the airport in Egypt so that we would go cross together. She made that journey all the way for me just so that we could cross together. The second I saw her, she had my face. And we immediately just held each other and we sobbed. I think we need to stop for a second. Sorry.
Zarefah?
Okay.
So your aunt picked you up.
So we immediately had such a solid connection. It was the first time I'd ever met members of my family that looked like me, and I think that kind of was healing in some respect. We then took, I think it was 2.5 days in Sinai. One of the most dehumanizing experiences of my life that I cannot really get into detail about because the Egyptians might prevent me from going back. Went through that journey together, arrived in Gaza and crossed the Rafah border. And again, it was a very emotionally beautiful moment, I think. My grandmother, Allah yarhamha, died in Gaza when my dad was very young. And I've held her name all of my life. So this kind of felt like she was returning in a sense. It was a very amazing experience. And I think kind of one of the ways, I mean, to get a little bit religious, the way that Allah's qadr has impacted my life in one of the most incredible ways. That I was able to experience that moment at the time that I did, because I wouldn't have been able to do it even a month later. So I was there for 2.5 months. I stayed with my aunt and her husband, my uncle Hamdi, Allah yarhamu. And my cousin, who was at home at the time. My aunt was an OBGYN. She was very well known around Gaza because she was such an incredibly powerful woman. She wasn't, she had like an emotional, nurturing side, but she was also just a powerhouse. You do not want to be on her bad side. She's a very powerful woman, and I look up to her. I will look up to her for the rest of my life and try to emulate who she was in every facet of my life. But yeah, she was very well known around Gaza because she had kind of been in so many women's lives. It was one of those things, you were kind of talking about it before when you were in Palestine, but you ask someone, do you know where this person lives? And everyone will tell you where Dr. Suma lives. Everyone knows where her clinic is. Everyone knows her husband, who was the dean of Al-Azhar Law School. So my uncle was assassinated in January of last year by a quadcopter drone. He was an elderly man, many health problems, couldn't run away from the military, was absolutely not a threat to the invading military. And then their house was demolished, the house where I lived for those months, where I learned how to cook, where I met my family for the first time, where I had all these incredible memories that are now just kind of feel like ghost stories because no one in them exists anymore. In just a moment.
Take your time.
Collecting myself. So the house was destroyed and my cousin and my auntie were displaced, kind of going around to different family houses that were still standing at the time. And on October 9th, 2024, so just a few months ago, she was in a taxi going to see one of her sons. The story that I heard is that they hadn't eaten meat in a really long time because things were really scarce and things were really expensive. And so she finally got her hands on some kebabs to give to her son. And she was in the taxi with the kebabs, going to the house where they had been displaced to, and an Israeli drone fired a missile at the taxi and killed her and everyone else in the taxi. We watched her taxi on Al Jazeera on fire live. So there's all these beautiful memories that I have of her and of being in Gaza, but I think I'm still trying to navigate how to not let that image in particular just destroy everything.
She sounds like she was an incredible person.
You would have liked her. She would have been hard on you.
Yeah.
But you would have liked her.
Oh, I'm sure I would have loved her. So she was an OBGYN.
Mm-hmm.
So she helped deliver babies.
Mm-hmm.
How many babies do you think she helped deliver?
Oh my gosh, so many. Because she was roughly my age when she graduated medical school in Syria and came back to Gaza. She had her own clinic, but also worked for a local hospital. She delivered. So when I was there, she was constantly on call delivering babies. And she was in her 60s. So the fact that at that age too, she would still be getting up in the middle of the night on call, ready to go. She was a very hardworking and determined woman.
How many children did she have?
She has 5.
5.
Yeah.
Are her children alive?
Alhamdulillah, yeah, they're okay.
Have their homes been demolished? Are they also...
Most of them aren't there anymore. She still has 2 sons that are currently in Gaza and displaced, living in tents. The house is gone. Everything that they ever owned is gone. The new car that I told you about was smashed by a tank. The only thing that remains of my knowledge is a conifer tree that my uncle planted when his kids were just babies.
What kind of tree?
A conifer tree.
A conifer?
It kind of is like a evergreen looking kind of pine tree.
Okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't produce any fruit.
No, but they had a beautiful backyard. My uncle in particular spent so much time in the backyard they taught me how to make the most amazing Arabic coffee. And I would deliver it to him in the yard while he would read and smoke. He was always reading because he was a professor, but there was a chicken coop outside with bunnies and chickens, and he would sit out there with them all day, chain smoking, drinking coffee. Yeah, but a beautiful yard. Olive trees, citrus trees, beautiful flowers, so much nature. It was gorgeous.
You also knew Rafat.
Mm-hmm.
How did you meet him?
I volunteered with We Are Not Numbers when I was there. We Are Not Numbers is an organization that was co-founded by him and some other folks, which trained young Palestinians in journalism. It helped them with English language skills, but then also taught them how to write and how to publish, kind of in an effort to assert a Palestinian narrative. So when I was there, I volunteered and did some workshops with the 2022 cohort, and he was there at the time, and so I got to meet him and spent some time with him, alhamdulillah, before he was martyred.
Allah yarhamu.
I mean,
what was his personality like? Was it similar to his tweets on X, which, he could be kind of aggressive and abrasive and funny?
I wasn't so close with him. Maybe if I was closer, he'd be a little bit more aggressive. But he was sarcastic and funny, but he wasn't as but again, I hadn't known him for long at all, so I might have just not seen that side. But a very intelligent person, and the rapport he had with his students, it's something that me, as someone that's aspiring to do similar work to what he did, and teaching and all of this stuff, it's what I aspire to have with my students, and the way that they looked up to him is just, it was so beautiful. Yeah.
The Israelis obviously wanted to exterminate not just the lives of these incredibly powerful and inspirational people in Gaza, but they also wanted to exterminate the infrastructure, the places where these memories could take place and exist. So given the amount of destruction, and now the Zionists announcing that they're going to basically relaunch their famine against the people of Gaza, do you think rebuilding a life in Gaza is possible given the last year?
Absolutely. And they will. And we can have a conversation about the logistics of how that's going to happen, and I think it will take years. But again, it's infrastructure that's been destroyed. I think in a lot of ways, again, the aim of a genocide is to eliminate a people and eliminate a society, and that hasn't happened. It's definitely damaged it. I don't want to romanticize the situation and say morale hasn't been damaged in Gaza, but they're not going anywhere. I mean, it's clear when Trump was making these claims that the U.S. was going to take Gaza for itself and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East, you saw Palestinians living in tents, but they were still laughing at Trump. They still see him as just as much of a joke as we do. And they're in the situation that they're in. So in that sense, I'm not concerned that they're not going to rebuild and they're not going to persevere. And I think that's again answering your question about why is it important to study this history. I think that's another reason. I think again, if history had started on October 6th and we didn't have this history of perseverance and rebuilding over and over again, and freeing our prisoners and organizing our prisoners and organizing our people and educating our children and bringing them up with this struggle, I would be extremely concerned. But we have enough of a foundation, I think, to cement that we're not going anywhere. Our cause isn't going anywhere. Our people aren't going anywhere. And neither is their absolute and moral and righteous conviction that this is their land and they would rather be martyred than to leave it.
What do you hope your research and your work will achieve for future generations of Palestinians?
Kind of in more simple terms, I mean, amplifying the voice of Palestinian prisoners and those who have borne the brunt of this horrific carceral violence and attempts to contain them and to annihilate them in so many different just psychotic ways. But I think what I mentioned to you before about the story of the mothers that would wear henna as they were going to receive the body of their child that was just executed at the British gallows. We don't know her name. We don't know the names of all of the women like her, or we don't know all the names of the prisoners who have gone through these systems. But we can do as much as we can, and that's what I'm trying to do, is to preserve their legacy and preserve their voice, an authentic Palestinian voice, that inshallah we can carry out and will be effective and helpful and productive for our own, narrative and discourse construction in this country and all over the world.
Zarefah, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this one and they're really going to benefit from the information you share with us.
Inshallah, I hope so. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to our channel. Also, if you'd like to support what we do, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on our website, where we post exclusive documentaries, podcasts, and videos just like this one about geopolitics, current events, and history. We built this website because of continued censorship of our videos, so please do consider becoming a member. Until next time.